Hello and welcome or welcome back to another episode of Shoulders Down. If you're new here, I'm Leah, a non-diet dietitian and body image coach, and this is a podcast where we talk about healing your relationship with food and body and breaking free from diet culture so you can live your most aligned and fulfilling life. So today I want to share some reflections on the new documentary Fit for TV, which looks at the show The Biggest Loser that is no longer active but was on TV for several years. There were several seasons. And honestly, I've been stalling making this podcast episode because the documentary was just so rough to get through. I watched the first episode like right after it came out, I think 2 weeks ago-ish as I'm recording. And then I finished the other two episodes last night in preparation for this podcast episode. I've just been dragging my feet because I wanted to watch the whole thing to give a proper analysis of it, but it just was so not what I wanted to put on the TV because it was so upsetting to watch. There were some good parts of it, and we're going to get into that today, but yeah, it was rough. And I personally grew up watching this show. Maybe you did too. At the time, I didn't really fully grasp how weight stigmatizing and dehumanizing the show was, but rewatching it through the lens of this documentary, seeing little snippets, and through the lens of now being an intuitive eating dietitian and body image coach, it left me completely floored in disbelief. It was way worse than I remembered it being in my head. And instead of doing a straight recap today for this episode, I'm going to break it down into two buckets. The first is what I appreciated about the documentary and the parts that felt important and validating and necessary. And then also the parts that I didn't like, the parts where I feel like the documentary missed the mark or reinforced harmful stereotypes or left me feeling like, oh, they could have done more here. My hope is that by unpacking it in this way, we can both acknowledge the value of finally pulling back the curtain on this show that was such a cultural phenomenon at the time, and also looking at the ways that it missed the mark and maybe fell short of being as impactful as it could have been. So, if you grew up watching The Biggest Loser, or if you've even just heard about this documentary recently, I feel like it's everywhere right now. Anytime there's a new documentary on Netflix, it really permeates society. This is an episode for you. I want to give you my take if you're curious about the perspective of a non-diet dietitian on this show and this documentary. So, with that, let's get into it. I'm first going to go into what I liked about the documentary, what I could appreciate, and then we're going to talk about the places where I feel like the documentary fell short or did harm. Before getting into these two buckets, I want to acknowledge that though I'm saying the documentary felt difficult for me to watch and felt upsetting and harmful, I want to acknowledge that I recognize that I hold several unearned privileges, one being the privilege of being straight size, so not existing in a body that is berated based on society's standards. And I recognize that watching this show, if you are someone who lives in a larger body and you don't have the privilege, the unearned privilege of being straight sized, I can only imagine the additional layer of harm and pain and sadness that this documentary might have brought up for you. Not to mention that watching Biggest Loser in the first place may have brought up for you. I recognize that though I've worked with several folks in all across the body size spectrum and I've heard and learned from them and their stories and I've done a lot of training, I still don't have personal lived experience in a body size that is berated and ridiculed on a societal level. And I recognize that I don't fully know that pain. And that feels really important to say. So, with that, let's get into what I liked about the documentary. So, when I clicked on this documentary on Netflix a few weeks ago, I was like pretty hopeful. I was like, okay, cool. Like, it's time that The Biggest Loser is exposed. It's so harmful. It's been several years since the last season was live, and since there's been a lot of research showing the long-term harms and physiological and metabolic impacts of extreme weight loss like there was on The Biggest Loser. So I was feeling pretty hopeful. And there were some things that I felt like were positive. There were also some things that I felt like could have been better, but again, we'll get there. So, to start, the first thing I really appreciated is I thought this documentary did a good job of exposing the harms that the contestants faced. So, so many different harms. The one of the beginning ones, there was the woman in that like first competition of the season. I think they had to run a mile, and if they didn't complete the mile, then they wouldn't get to continue on the show. And there was this one woman who collapsed close to the finish line and was like crawling to the finish line, had to be airlifted, was unconscious, and she ultimately had, I believe, something called rhabdomyosis, which is like muscle damage where it's like starting to break down muscle into your bloodstream. And she was in like a life-threatening situation. She was in the hospital for several days. She was unconscious. She had a really near death experience in the pursuits of trying to be on this show for something that was supposed to make her healthy. I felt like that was just one example of how the documentary did a good job of exposing the sort of irony that like this is for people's health, yet look at how many people are like collapsing in the gym and throwing up and having to be medically evacuated from the ranch or from the competitions. That to me, I think it really did kind of show the severity of how this was actually leading people to be in negative health situations. And other ways it showed the harms. They spoke on how the contestants were not eating enough calories. At one point, they said, yeah, the contestants were being encouraged to eat 800 calories a day while burning 6 to 8,000 calories per day. And even the doctors were like, no, this is not healthy. It's not good for your metabolism. So I thought that that was good. At least they were saying like, okay, no, like this isn't good. This isn't helping people. Another example that sticks out when I think about how they exposed the harm that the show was doing was this contestant. I believe his name was Danny, and he won one of the seasons. He was one of the main people who was interviewed for the documentary. And he said how when he was on that stage getting weighed in for the last time, being declared the winner of The Biggest Loser, he was literally dealing with internal bleeding from like severe dehydration because he wanted to win so bad that he was not eating. He was like having, I think, like lemon and maple syrup or water or some kind of liquid diet only. And so I do think that that helped people see, like, look at this person, he lost all this weight, but at such a high cost. Like, he's dealing with internal bleeding. Or there was a case where someone developed a severe eating disorder. I do think the documentary did a decent job of exposing the medical harm. And then also the psychological harm. I don't think they did as good of a job highlighting this. I mean, they definitely spoke about it, some people experiencing PTSD from immense shame, feeling like a failure, especially after regaining the weight. They talked about this one female contestant from New York. She was a police officer, and how she experienced such shame from the other like men that were police officers in her unit. And how when she came back home from the show, these men were all like berating her, and they thought that that was okay because she was on a public show about her weight. But they said really horrible things to her and made her feel awful, and how that really stayed with her. So I thought that they did do a good job, semi good job of highlighting the shame and the psychological harms. There was also another contestant, I believe her name was Joelle, who was really bullied on the show. It felt like Bob, one of the trainers, really like singled her out and was especially mean to her. And she was one of the women who was interviewed for the documentary. So I don't know. That felt decent. I'm hesitating because I don't feel like they wrapped it all up and brought it all home in the psychological harm area as well as they could have. But they definitely still at least exposed how long lasting these emotional impacts were for these folks who were on the show. And not only was it while they were on the show being screamed at by the trainers, you see that. It's so visceral. When you're watching it back, it's so visceral. Like seeing Jillian Michaels and Bob Harper like scream in the faces of these humans, you can see the psychological harm, but I do feel like they could have done a little bit more to kind of bring that all home and elaborate on it. But I will give it to them that, okay, I'm glad that they highlighted that in some way. Okay, the next piece that I could appreciate about this documentary is that I do feel like it revealed and highlighted the unsustainability aspect of intentional weight loss. The most obvious example of this was Danny, one of the contestants who was on the show and who actually won. He's the one who had that internal bleeding when he was standing on the scale for his final weigh in. He was one of the main people being interviewed. And it's quite obvious when you're watching Danny's interview, he lives in a larger body now. So you're seeing this footage of him in a much, much smaller body from when he was the winner of The Biggest Loser. They're playing back this footage and reflecting on it, but then you're seeing him in real time living in a larger body. And I think there's a couple ways to take that. Like, of course, there's going to be people who watch this documentary and are like, oh, what a shame. You know, he fell off the wagon. He couldn't keep it up in that kind of harmful way of self-blame or of kind of putting it all on him and personal responsibility. But I do think it also helps to show almost no one who was being interviewed, even if they were able to maintain some amount of the weight loss, almost no one looked as small as they did on the show. It because it's not sustainable. And then in some of the later episodes, they got into a little bit of the research, some of these more long-term Biggest Loser follow-up studies, exposing how that kind of extreme weight loss blunts the metabolism even several years after and can do permanent long-term damage on a person's metabolism. And this has to do, like, they could have gone more into this, right? Like, if they had an intuitive eating dietitian being interviewed on the show, we could have talked about, I say we as like me on behalf of the intuitive eating dietitian world, we could have talked about how this is because your body's trying to protect you and it perceives that amount of extreme weight loss as a threat to your survival. And then in response, it says, okay, let's up the set point weight. Let's try to get back to that set point weight or higher to protect against future threats of starvation, future threats of losing that amount of muscle mass and losing that amount of weight so quickly. So this is your body actually being really smart and working with you, not against you. The body's natural compensatory response to extreme weight loss is weight gain. The famous statistic is that 95% of pursuits of intentional weight loss result in gaining the weight back within 5 years and often gaining back even more weight than was initially lost. That comes from a well-known meta-analysis looking at intentional weight loss over a longer period of time and seeing how sustainable it is. And I'll link to that research in the show notes if you're interested. So I feel like they did touch on how this wasn't sustainable, not only from a metabolic standpoint, because you're swimming upstream against your body. Your body's trying to, it's slowing down your metabolism. It's trying to get you to gain weight in response to that perceived threat of starvation and perceived threat of your survival being at risk, which it was because that amount of weight loss in such a short period of time is dangerous for your health besides the aspect of it being unsustainable on a metabolic level, it's also unsustainable in that people have to do shit in the world. They can't be on a ranch exercising all day, every day, and having this like intense team looking after them, trying to meet the goal of weight loss. Like in everyday life, we have responsibilities, we have jobs, families, things you have to do. You don't have that kind of time to exercise that amount, to spend that much focus and energy and resources on what you're eating. It's just not sustainable for anyone. And this is a little bit of a stretch in terms of like being related, but just stay with me for a second. I recently got back from my annual hiking trip every year. Two of my friends and I do a section hike of the Appalachian Trail. And this year, when we got back, I was like, some of my pants are loose. I noticed that. And it made sense to me. We were hiking all day, every day for several days in a row. And it makes sense. That's an amount of exercise that's way, way, way more than what I'm usually doing. However, a few weeks after being home, I'm like, oh, okay, my stuff fits like normal again. And an older diety part of me would have been like, oh, how can I try and keep this weight off? But knowing what I know as an intuitive eating dietitian and a person who has been personally on an intuitive eating journey for close to 11 years now, what I know is, yeah, obviously that's not sustainable. I'm not hiking all day, every day, 10 plus miles a day in my regular life. So, of course, my body's going to get back to its set point weight. It was a little probably under its set point weight because I was exercising in a way that was out of the ordinary for a little blip of time while on this trip. But I think that's the difference is like knowing, of course, this isn't sustainable and expecting my body to fluctuate a little bit back to its normal range instead of trying to fight it and trying to keep my body in a place where, of course, is not sustainable because I don't have that kind of time in my regular life to hike 10 plus miles a day. So that I think they did do a good job of exposing that piece of like, this isn't sustainable, not only because of the metabolic adaptations that are ultimately working against someone to maintain long-term intentional weight loss, but also because of the structure of living on this ranch and spending all this time and energy to try and lose weight, going from that to regular life. So I thought they did a pretty good job of that. Another part that I thought that they did a decent job of, it's funny, as I'm going through this section of what I liked about it, I'm like, every one of these things that I liked about it comes with like I liked it, but they definitely could have done better. But they still have to give credit where credit is due. Like some of these things were still good. Okay. I'm like laughing. I'm like, did I like anything about it? Yes, of course I did. I just am like, oh, they could have done it better. Another thing I liked about it. I did think they did a good job of some of these like behind the curtain moments, specifically with the professionals that were the consultants of the show. So mainly I'm thinking about the trainers, Jillian and Bob, and then the doctors. Or there was just one doctor mainly. I think at the end there was like a second woman who joined the team. But yeah, they exposed things like how Jillian Michaels was giving caffeine pills to the contestants and they exposed sort of this conflict between the trainers and the doctors and how some of the things the doctors weren't fully aware of that the trainers were doing and how there was a conflict between doing what's right for the participants through the lens of their health and science versus doing what would make for better TV. I thought they exposed that conflict decently. I thought they did a decent job of exposing how the trainers were out of their scope. I think they could have hammered that home a little more. To me, I'm like, oh my God, they were so out of their scope. There was this one moment where they were saying, like, one of the trainers said, Bob, I think, being interviewed, he said, no one was going to tell us what to do when it came to diet and exercise. Like, they were gonna run the show. And I do think it was kind of showing how they left their scope. They were trainers. Their scope was training, yet they were trying to tell the contestants what to eat. They were trying to therapize the contestants, and that was not great. Like they that's not their zone of expertise. They should have left that to someone else. I mean, even training, even if it was their zone of expertise, their training philosophies are questionable, but at least it's what they have background and experience in. They should not have been telling people what to eat or trying to therapize them because that isn't what they have training in, and that's harmful. So I can appreciate how some of the doctors who were interviewed were exposing how they didn't agree with the show, some of the things that were being done, some of the ways that the trainers were encouraging participants to lose weight in unhealthy ways. I mean, I think that that was helpful because it did kind of show that aspects of the show were against medical advice, even though they had a medical provider on the team. It wasn't they weren't necessarily like being fully truthful to that medical provider or communicating everything that was going on. Even with all that being said, I'm like, ugh, but this doctor was on a show just about trying to get people to lose weight. So I'm a little bit even skeptical of that doctor. But I can appreciate like that doctor is still a doctor with medical training and was probably one of the only people on the show who actually had the best interest of the contestants in mind and was there to protect them on some level. So I can appreciate that, though it feels conflicting to even say that because a doctor that would sign up to be a specialist on a show about weight loss, like it gives me pause to begin with. But again, I can hold that at least this is a person with a ton of training and who at least is somewhat looking after the best interests of the participants and their well-being. This is probably the thing I liked the most about the documentary and was most excited. I think I literally gasped with like excitement when I saw this person pop up on the screen. I really appreciated that they interviewed a fat activist named Aubrey Gordon for the show. It definitely created a little bit more balance. So if you're not familiar, Aubrey Gordon is an author, she's a podcast host, she's a fat activist, and I say the word fat in a reclaimed sense. She came out with a film, or she starred in a film a few years ago called Your Fat Friend. And it was an incredible movie about fatness and the complexities of being a fat person in the society. And it was just a really beautiful movie, really touching and really important. I wish that everyone would watch this movie. She is a prominent figure in my world, meaning like the anti-diet intuitive eating world. Like everyone knows Aubrey Gordon. But I recognize that like most of the world probably doesn't because anti-diet and fat activism is still not mainstream. So the fact that they got her as a participant to sort of weigh in on the show and to kind of highlight the other side, defending the humanity of fat people and their rights and exposing the harms of weight stigma and diet culture, like that was amazing. I was really impressed that they got her and just really happy that they got her. I do wish that there was more of her. I think she could have been more of a focal point of the documentary. And I think they could have asked her more about her experience being fat, and she could have spoken about it a little bit more as a person who writes professionally and speaks professionally about this. So I wish that they leaned on her a little bit more, but I was so happy that they at least had her in it. I was very, very pleasantly surprised. I think that's a really big step because she's not someone who was on the show, but she's someone who has experienced the harms of weight stigma and has made a whole career of speaking about it, doing education and advocacy work. She's incredibly accomplished, has amazing books and podcasts talking about this. So I wish they leaned a little bit more into her expertise and highlighted more of the work she's done. But I was just so pleased that they had her in the show at all. Okay, and then some other reflective pieces that I just want to mention. There was one of the doctors at the end where they were talking about the long-term research on some of the Biggest Loser participants and how they were looking at the long-term harms metabolically and how almost everyone had regained all the weight back. There was one of the doctors who did say he later regretted his role in participating in the show after reading some of the long-term harms. And I thought that that was important. Someone admitting, I thought this was good at the time, but I don't actually think it was as good now that I look at the long-term research. That felt important for a medical professional to be honest about changing their mind, thinking that they were doing the right thing, but then realizing from looking at the research that maybe it was more harmful than they realized. Also, there was this moment at the end where they were talking about this one contestant, I believe her name was Rachel, and how she walked out on the scale for a final weigh-in and she was pretty much emaciated, and how everyone was like, she took it too far, she got too thin, she lost too much weight. To me, this really highlights just one of the paradoxes of being a woman in our society of like, oh, you're too big. Okay, now you lost less weight. Oh no, but you lost too much weight. Now you're too thin. What's wrong with you? But beyond that, I think that that moment was really important to include of like, yeah, here's a participant who was doing what the show told her to do, losing as much weight as possible. And guess what? It went too far. She developed an eating disorder. She became sickly thin, and that wasn't healthy. And people really were able to see that when she walked out. People were concerned. Of course, I hate that it had to get to that point. Like, why can't people be concerned when someone loses 15 pounds in a week, even if they're going from being heavy to less heavy, but still heavy? 15 pounds in a week is straight up dangerous. That's malnourishment. That's, if I when I was working in the hospital as a clinical dietitian, and if someone lost 15 pounds in a week, we would flag that as malnutrition. So I hate that it has to go as far as someone physically looking emaciated for the public to be concerned, and that for someone who's still in a larger body, we're praising it. And for someone who is looking like skin and bones, we're only then are we worried. But at least it highlighted, look, this can go too far. This can lead to serious eating disorders and to conditions where people become sick. It's not good. And I think that including that felt important. So that's kind of a catch-all of some moments I wanted to point out. The last thing I want to say that I think they did a decent job of that I could appreciate about this documentary is that it felt like they did highlight how the show wasn't actually about health. It was about ratings, it was about views, and it was about capitalist drive to make money off of a new TV show. And I don't know, maybe that was less front and center as I'm thinking. I really like that's what it did for me is really highlighted. Obviously, this is not different than so many other things in the diet and wellness industry. They don't care about your health. They want to sell you shit. They don't care about your health. They just want you to be a customer to convince you that you need this thing, you need this pill or this app or this diet or this cookbook, I don't know. And they don't really care. They just want you to be giving them your money. And in the case of The Biggest Loser, they want views. Views equal money. How do you get views? You do increasingly shocking things, like yelling at in the faces of these humans, or trying to get contestants to lose more and more shocking amounts of weight in shorter and shorter periods of time. And that's what they did. They got views. They made money. The show was successful until it wasn't, until some of this stuff started becoming exposed. But I just thought that the documentary did do a good job of exposing this reality that so much that we think is about health is actually just about someone trying to profit off of us. Okay, now for what I didn't like about the documentary. I don't know if you're getting this vibe, but I think there's probably more that I didn't like about it. So that will be probably easier for me to get into. Okay, the first thing I didn't like is that the weight stigma component was largely unaddressed. It felt like such a missed opportunity to talk about the harms of putting people on public TV and humiliating them for their bodies and shaming them for their bodies and treating them like they're not humans because of their bodies. How could we not address the component of weight stigma? And if you're not familiar, weight stigma is the systemic mistreatment of folks in larger body sizes. And it looks so many different ways. It looks like, people making remarks about folks in larger bodies walking by on the street, or it looks like clothing sizes not accommodating larger sizes, or it looks like airlines not having seats to accommodate folks in larger bodies. It looks like medical doctors telling someone in a larger body to just lose weight instead of doing a full workup and really trying to understand what their symptoms are and what might be going on. There are so many examples of weight stigma, and the research shows that weight stigma in and of itself leads to negative health outcomes. if you want a whole deep dive on this, I have an episode called Five Reasons Why Your Weight Doesn't Determine Your Health. And one of those reasons goes into weight stigma. And basically, it's not the fat in and of itself of being in a larger body, it's the experience of weight stigma that comes with living in a larger body in our fat phobic society that leads to increased stress levels, that leads to negative health outcomes because of the chronic increased stress levels. It leads to worse medical care, which leads to negative health outcomes. It leads to weight cycling, which leads to negative health outcomes. So it's not the weight in and of itself. It's the experience of weight stigma and how fat people are treated in our society. And they really miss the mark on talking about that. The contestants were still ultimately framing weight as unhealthy. Like they were said a few times, like, oh, when I went on the show, I was X pounds, I was unhealthy. And that's not necessarily true. It's not like you were unhealthy because of the weight. It could be that you were unhealthy, but you were unhealthy because you were scared to go to a gym because this society we live in didn't make someone feel welcome in a gym who's in a larger body, or because all the advice you've ever gotten is to lose weight and you haven't been educated on health promoting behaviors because of medical weight stigma, or you had a doctor who missed a diagnosis because they saw that you were in a larger body and just chalked it up to weight instead of doing a full workup on you. So I really was bummed that they didn't get into that. And I still felt like the contestants were really blaming themselves instead of bringing in this societal piece of how our society's attitudes towards people in larger bodies is harmful. One of the contestants, Tracy, said something like, you know, we ruined our metabolisms because we were obese. She was blaming herself instead of blaming the show for ruining their metabolism, or blaming the systems that make us feel like we have to lose weight, and the pursuit of losing and gaining and losing and gaining and weight cycling ruins your metabolism. So I was bummed that they didn't highlight that piece, and it still really felt like weight was being painted as personal responsibility, and there was so much fat phobia still woven into the documentary without getting into the harms of weight stigma in and of itself. So that was a bummer. Another thing I didn't like about the documentary is I felt like the dehumanization of the contestants was minimized. There was clips being replayed of screaming in the contestants' faces, threatening them, humiliating them. The contestants were shown shirtless or in their sports bras and on the scale, and just like it just seems so dehumanizing. And I didn't feel like that was exposed as much. Like, I mean, there was one moment where one of the women was like, you know, everyone I've ever known in my life is watching this show, and I'm in this like flimsy sports bra. My boobs are at my knees. They wouldn't let us wear something else. We had to wear this outfit that they gave us, and I felt awful. And so, I mean, they spoke to it a little bit there, but like, I wanted more of like, can you believe how these humans were treated? Publicly humiliated because of their bodies, the way these trainers were screaming at them, the act of like these like temptation experiments where they were put in a room with a bunch of food that would be considered unhealthy, and like animals in a zoo, like being like, oh, let's see, are you going to eat this food or not? It just felt so dehumanizing. And I felt like they could have done so much more with highlighting that, but they didn't. So I really didn't like that. I spoke about this earlier, but there was this contestant, Joelle, who obviously lives in a larger body, and she's also a black woman. So there was this intersectionality piece of her identity as a woman, a black woman, and a fat person. And I felt like that was a moment too that there could have been a conversation about intersectionality. I mean, I'm asking for a lot from this documentary from Netflix. I feel like, of course, there wasn't a conversation about intersectionality, but just while we're kind of going through where I feel like they could have done more, she was really singled out by Bob, one of the trainers. And I don't know, I felt like that was perhaps related to having multiple marginalized identities. Um, that just felt so yucky to me. And again, I just felt like they kind of glazed over it and they could have done more. there. I also did not like how the documentary medicalized fatness. So there's this one doctor they spoke to at the end. I believe her name was Jennifer Kearns, and she's an obesity medicine doctor. And she said this line of like, oh, well, we should treat fat people as if they have any illness. Like this is an illness. This is just something that they have an illness. And that just it feels first of all, her being an obesity medicine doctor, I'm just like, oh no, like red flags already. Like her whole career is devoted to this. And I want to name that she came to the work with her own lived experience. Like she actually was a person who lived in a larger body herself, and that's what made her want to pursue a career in obesity medicine, quote unquote. And then she was actually a contestant on The Biggest Loser and later became a doctor for the show. So she I don't know, this line about like, oh, well, we should just treat fat people as if they have an illness. It felt dismissive to, again, weight stigma and how much else goes into the correlation between being a higher weight and having negative health outcomes. I wish, like, I thought she could have talked about weight cycling. I thought she could have talked about health at every size. Ugh. She was trying, right? She was like, no, we shouldn't be shaming these people. They have an illness. And I'm like, yes, we shouldn't be shaming them, but not because they have an illness, because they don't. They have a variation in body size and they're a normal response to attempting to lose weight, which is for your body to gain the weight back and get even bigger every time. Instead of being like, oh, we shouldn't shame these contestants because they have an illness, I wish it was, we just shouldn't shame these contestants because they're human beings. So yeah, the medicalization of fatness was really a strong thread throughout. There was one of the doctors who was like, yeah, I was upset by the fat phobic comments, but instead of advocating for fat acceptance and weight neutral care, she went on her own weight loss journey, this woman, Jennifer Kearns, which is fine and everyone has body autonomy. But like, again, I just wish the message was okay, this doctor was upset by the fat phobic comments. What if she instead went down the road of how to address weight stigma and fat phobia instead of, oh, let me try and just make these people thinner because they're the problem, whereas the problem is society, the weight stigma that is baked into society. And this was a bummer because she's a doctor, so she really has a chance to impact this on like on the medical system level, but instead she was like, oh no, like I want to have empathy for these people and help them lose weight, which I get and is at least a step in trying to treat them more human. But instead of, oh, I want to treat these people like humans and I have empathy for them because of their body size, I wish she focused more on, I have empathy for these people because of the weight stigma that they experience and I want to be an advocate for change in our weight stigmatizing society. I don't know, maybe I just kind of got like lost you there. I'm just like processing this kind of in real time. It was close. It was like let's not shame these people, but then it didn't bring it all home with let's fight to combat weight stigma. It was like let's not shame these people for their body size. Let's like help them lose weight in a more compassionate way. So it was a start and it was close, but it still missed the mark. Okay, another part of this documentary that I couldn't stand is how the creators of it were really doubling down on it. They were like, I don't see anything wrong with this. Like, we were helping people. And there was almost this like hero complex. There was this one scene where all of these contestants were saying thank you to the biggest loser and they were trying to paint it as like this like amazing thing that helped change people's lives. But it didn't. Like that maybe in the short term it did, but in the long term, people gained the weight back, ended up feeling shameful and miserable, and it didn't actually help them in the ways that it seemed on the surface. So I really couldn't stand particularly the creators of the show just like doubling down and not admitting that they did harm. Ugh, that was like made my skin crawl. It's like, come on, like this is you have an opportunity to speak honestly and be a human and say, you know, we fucked up. We thought this was going to help people. We now know, we're looking at the research, the long-term impacts of this. We now know that it's done some harm and we can own that. But they didn't do that. So that was a real disappointment and it really just like made my skin crawl the way that the creators were speaking. Okay, the last thing I want to say here is that oh, I'm thinking about this question of like, did this documentary do more harm than good? Or did it do more good than harm by exposing that this show was something that at the time we didn't really think much about, but now being 2025, we know that intentional weight loss is often not sustainable, is harmful. The show was harmful in so many more ways than we probably initially thought. I don't know. I wonder what you think because what I'm left feeling conflicted about is even though this documentary aired and the intention was to pull back the curtain, I feel like it kind of like re-triggered people because like I kind of forgot about The Biggest Loser, something on a while ago, and I'm sure a lot of people it's like buried deep in their mind, and it like resurfaced this really screwed up show and played old clips from it, seeing people being screamed at, dehumanized, seeing people talk about their bodies in a way where they feel like they're blaming their body as a problem for their marriage, for their happiness, for everything. Seeing some of these harmful stereotypes reinforced of like, oh, these people are lazy and they don't have self-control that were threads in the original show that were reinforced just by re-airing the clips from the original show as part of the documentary. So my fear is though the goal of the documentary was clearly to expose the show, I fear that it maybe did more harm by showing these scenes, like these weigh-ins and screaming at people and showing numbers of weights. And I just worry that it may be unintentionally reinforce negative beliefs. Like maybe some people watched it and were like, okay, I get it. You know, that Jillian Michaels is mean and she made people do caffeine pills and like there's all these negative things but like look how much weight they lost, like I want to lose that much weight. I worry that people maybe like won't walk away from it with the take home messages that feel important because it's still so focused on weight loss and fat phobia is so front and center throughout the entire documentary, even though they try to expose harms of the documentary, like they didn't fully get there. So it feels like they kind of just kicked up the dust and then just like, I don't know, like perhaps triggered a lot of people and also like the weigh-ins, of seeing the numbers, I couldn't help but think about some of my clients and it's like, okay, you see that number and you're like, oh, this person's on a show for fat people to lose weight. What if you're that number? And you're like, oh shit, like I didn't think this was a problem for me, but like I'm the number of someone on The Biggest Loser, so like maybe I do need to be worried about my weight or something, or maybe this is a problem when perhaps that person previously was finally getting to a place of making peace. So yeah. Okay, wait, one other thing. I hate when people do this, and it's not just with weight. I think it's with other things too, like the show What Not to Wear comes to mind. But like in their audition videos to be on The Biggest Loser, people are like, disheveled, kind of in like more casual clothes, like not like having like their hair or makeup done, which is fine. But then as they start losing more and more weight, they're like getting hair and makeup done and like, in nicer outfits and stuff. And then I feel like it just paints this message of like, when you're larger, you're not worthy of taking care of yourself or like having nice clothes that you enjoy or having your makeup done or whatever. And I feel like it just like adds to this message of like your whole life will be better. But in reality, you could start being intentional about outfits and hair and makeup and how you present yourself and whatever in any body size, but it really kind of it feels like it ends up giving this message of like that's only for you if you're skinny, which isn't true. And when I brought up What Not to Wear or before because I don't know if you ever seen that show, but it's like when they come on the show, they're just like looking so sad and like frumpled and whatever. And then at the end, they like bust out in their whole new wardrobe and they have their hair done and their makeup done and like, wow, look, they have this whole new life and they're so happy. But I don't know, I feel like it just like the before is such like a it feels like they're like dramatizing it and like really leaning into it and like overemphasizing how much having a new wardrobe could like change your life and also in turn kind of shitting on the before of like what if that's how someone dresses now and they don't have any intention in changing it and they're happy and then you're like poo-pooing that of like oh their life sucked when they were dressing like that or when they looked like that. It just feels like they're over dramatizing it and it's harmful. Okay, that was a big side tangent. So yeah, this leaves me with this question of did the doc do more harm than good? I really don't know. I kind of feel like, yeah, I really don't know. I really don't know. I'd be curious your thoughts. Some closing reflections here. I guess that I am glad overall that this aired. Maybe that's me saying that it did more good than harm because it pulled back the curtain and exposed real harms of pursuing intentional weight loss and of the diet industry. So, yeah, I'm glad that it did that. Oh wait, did I mention this earlier? No. Okay. Sorry, I'm all over the place because I literally just watched this last night. Wait, one other thing I want to say is they talked about how Bob Harper had a really severe heart attack, like on the gym floor. Not on the show, but like years later. And I thought that that was such a good example of how weight doesn't determine health. Here is a guy who is literally a trainer, looks like the picture of being strong and healthy, who had a heart attack. So even if you exercise and do all the quote unquote right things, you're not immune to negative health outcomes, which just felt like kind of an irony because sort of the thesis of the show in a way is if you do all these things, you'll be healthy. If you work out, if you eat right. But the trainer who was supposed to be like the picture of health collapsed from a heart attack that almost killed him. I think he was like dead for 9 minutes or something, which shows that exercise doesn't mean that you're safe from negative health outcomes. Yeah, I thought that that did kind of show like weight isn't an indicator of health. Because here he is in like a very conventionally attractive, strong looking body, yet he still dealt with a major health scare. So anyway, I think maybe I did mention that earlier. Or maybe I didn't. I don't know. Whatever. Okay. So closing thoughts. I'm glad it aired. I'm glad I pulled back the curtain and exposed some of the harms. But overall, I'm frustrated that it didn't go far enough into deep discussion of weight stigma or any discussion of weight stigma, intersectionality, and the overall cultural harm of glorifying the show. The real villain isn't the contestants or their bodies, it's diet culture, it's weight stigma, and it's capitalism for profiting off of people's insecurity. I want to invite you to reflect on your own memories of the show. What did you internalize from it? How might these messages still be showing up in your life? And what do you think? If you saw the documentary, do you think it did more harm than good or vice versa? I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at leah@leahkernrd.com. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. And I think that's all I got. I hope you can forgive me that this was a little all over the place. As I said, I just finished watching it last night. I just wanted to get this out sooner rather than later because I've been getting a lot of questions, people asking me my thoughts on it. So that's what I got for you. I'm sure I did not cover everything. There was a lot in there, and I was like aggressively taking notes while watching Netflix last night. So I'm sure there's some things I missed. If there's anything I missed or any questions that you have or anything you want to add, please reach out. I really love being in conversation about these things. That is all for today. I will see you in our next episode of Shoulders Down.